The night in Willow Creek was cold and silent, but inside the Miller household, the atmosphere was boiling. Sarah Miller, just 13 years old, stood in the center of the living room, facing her parents' stern expressions. Her mother, Margaret, clutched a handkerchief in her trembling hands, while her father, John, kept his arms crossed, staring at the floor as if his daughter's words were thorns. "I'm pregnant," Sarah repeated, her voice shaking as if trying to convince herself that she had already said it. For a moment, silence engulfed the room, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Margaret was the first to react, raising her hands to her face as if to ward off reality. "This can't be true, not in our family." Her voice rose, laden with disbelief. "Who's responsible?" John finally spoke, his voice low but heavy, like a storm about to break. Sarah hesitated. She didn't have the strength to explain what had happened. Judgment was etched into every detail of their faces. "Do you even understand what this means? The shame it will bring to this house?" Margaret continued, now openly crying. "I didn't choose this," Sarah responded, pain and anger blending in her voice. "I just want help." But her plea fell on deaf ears. John stood abruptly, crossing the room in firm strides, stopping right in front of her. "Help? Did you even think about the consequences of your actions? About our reputation?" He turned to Margaret, seeking support. "She's ruined us." The words were a trigger. Margaret was now sobbing loudly, while John grabbed his jacket hanging by the door. "If you've chosen this path, Sarah, you're on your own. Get out of my house." Sarah froze. Those words carried the weight of an irrevocable sentence. She looked to her mother, searching for any trace of compassion, but Margaret averted her gaze, unable to face her. "Dad, please," Sarah began, but John was already opening the door, pointing outside with a firm gesture. Her heart shattered. With a violin in one hand and a small backpack in the other, she left the house without looking back, tears streaming freely down her face. The door slammed shut behind her. Outside, the night felt darker than ever. The biting wind carried a fine drizzle that clung to her skin, chilling her to the bone. Sarah wandered aimlessly through Willow Creek's narrow streets, feeling the crushing weight of rejection. The few people still out cast curious glances, but no one approached. When she reached the Central Park, her legs gave out. She sat on an old bench, clutching the violin as if it were her only anchor. Cold, hunger, and loneliness mixed into a void that seemed impossible to fill. The sobs came in waves, silent, restrained, until she had no strength left. She looked at the distant lights of the houses surrounding the park. Inside, people were warm, loved, living lives that felt unattainable. "How am I going to survive?" she murmured to herself as the wind blew mercilessly. In the distance, she heard men's voices laughing. Her body tensed with fear as she realized the sounds were getting closer. "Well, look what we've got here." A deep, mocking voice echoed in the darkness. 3 figures emerged from the shadows. Sarah's heart raced. They were young, dressed in dirty clothes with malicious looks in their eyes. "All alone, girl?" one of them asked, approaching slowly. Sarah tried to stand, but her legs were weak. Her instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. "Leave her alone!" A firm, authoritative female voice suddenly rang out. The men turned quickly, facing the silhouette of a woman. She held a shopping bag and seemed determined, though she wasn't tall or particularly intimidating. "Mind your own business, lady," one of them shouted, but she didn't budge. "I've already called the police," the woman lied convincingly. Hesitant, the men backed away, muttering insults before disappearing into the darkness. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, stepping closer to Sarah. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, still frozen in place. Before she could respond, her strength gave out and she fainted. When Sarah woke up, she was in a different place. The warmth of a blanket enveloped her, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. She tried to sit up, but a gentle voice stopped her. "Don't push yourself, you need to rest." It was the same woman who had saved her in the park. Now Sarah could see her more clearly. A middle-aged woman with brown hair tied in a bun and kind eyes. "My name is Grace Williams. I brought you to my home." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Grace quickly handed her a glass of water. "You're safe here, dear," Grace said with a smile that for the first time in a long while made Sarah feel less alone. The smell of fresh bread and hot coffee filled Grace's small kitchen. Sarah, still adjusting to the cozy surroundings, watched as Grace took a tray of golden croissants out of the oven. The bakery's warmth was a stark contrast to the cold night she had been found in the park. "Here, try one," Grace said, placing a steaming croissant on a plate in front of Sarah. Sarah hesitated before accepting, but as she took a bite, a comforting warmth spread through her. "It's delicious," she murmured, her voice still faint but sincere. Grace smiled, sitting beside her at the small kitchen table. "I know you must be confused, but I want you to know you can stay here as long as you need, and if you'd like, you can help me in the bakery. It's not glamorous, but keeping your hands busy helps calm the mind." Sarah nodded slowly. Grace's gesture wasn't just kind. It was an anchor in a moment when she felt like she was sinking. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of wind chimes tinkling at the window of the small room Grace had prepared for her. She looked around, still a bit disoriented. The walls were a comforting shade of pale yellow, and a plaid blanket was neatly folded at the foot of the bed. After dressing, she went downstairs to the bakery, where Grace was already wearing an apron, arranging the display with bread and cakes. "Good morning, did you sleep well?" Grace asked. "Yes, thank you." "Great. Come on. I'll show you how we do things around here." The day was full of activity. Sarah learned how to roll dough, weigh ingredients, and organize products in the display. Grace was patient, explaining everything carefully. Gradually, Sarah began to feel useful, something she hadn't felt in weeks. But the bakery's comfort contrasted with the atmosphere of the town. Willow Creek was a small place where secrets didn't stay hidden for long. As the days passed, the townspeople began to notice Sarah's presence. "Did you see that girl at Grace's bakery?" whispered the women in the market line. "I heard she's pregnant. So young. What a scandal." The whispers eventually reached Grace's ears, but she didn't seem to care. She continued to treat Sarah with the same kindness, as if the comments were nothing more than distant noise. One afternoon, as Sarah swept the bakery floor, the doorbell chimed, announcing the arrival of a group of young men. Dylan, known as the town bully, led the group. He wore a smug smile, and his friends laughed at some inside joke. "So this is the new helper?" Dylan asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah stopped what she was doing, trying to ignore them. "You know, Grace, maybe your bakery would do better without certain types of people around here," he continued, staring directly at Sarah. Grace stepped out from behind the counter, facing the group with firmness. "If you're not here to buy something, I suggest you leave. I won't tolerate that kind of behavior here." Dylan shrugged, but before leaving, slammed into a shelf of bread, knocking some loaves to the floor. "That was an accident, of course," he said with a cynical grin. Sarah crouched to pick up the bread, her face hot with shame and anger. Grace, however, gently touched her shoulder. "Don't let this get to you, dear. They only act this way because they're afraid of what they don't understand." Grace's words lingered in Sarah's mind, but they weren't enough to erase the feeling of being a burden. As days turned into weeks, rumors around town began to take their toll on the bakery. Some longtime customers stopped coming, and sales dropped. Grace said nothing, but Sarah could sense her worry. "Is this because of me?" Sarah asked one evening as the two closed up the bakery. Grace paused, looking at Sarah with a serious expression. "No. People make their own choices, and it's not your fault if some choose ignorance. I chose to help you because I believe everyone deserves a second chance, and I'm not going to back down." Sarah tried to smile, but the weight of guilt still lingered. That night, everything changed. When Grace and Sarah arrived at the bakery the next morning, they found the windows shattered and words painted in red across the storefront. "Get out." Sarah stood in shock while Grace took a deep breath, trying to contain her anger. "This can't go on," Grace muttered, surveying the damage. "This is because of me, Grace. I'll leave. I don't want you to suffer because of me," Sarah said, tears welling up in her eyes. Grace placed her hands firmly on Sarah's shoulders. "No, Sarah. You're not a problem. You're a blessing, and I won't let these people's hatred defeat us." Grace's words were like a spark for Sarah, but at the same time she knew the cost for Grace was becoming too high. As Grace began scrubbing the paint from the wall, Sarah gazed into the distance, trying to decide what her next step should be. That night, while Grace slept, Sarah quietly got up from her makeshift bed in the guest room. She took her violin, the only link to her dreams, and packed a few clothes into her backpack. The decision to leave had solidified in her mind. Staying meant risking the one person who had shown her kindness. Sarah left a note on the kitchen table, its few words brimming with pain and gratitude. "Grace, thank you for everything. You were the only light in my darkness, but I can't be a burden to you anymore. I will find my path and prove that your kindness wasn't in vain." Sarah, with a heavy heart, she opened the front door and stepped into the cold dawn. The streets of Willow Creek were empty, save for the distant sound of a dog barking. As she walked, the silence of the town felt oppressive, as if every corner whispered her name, reminding her there was no place for her here. Hours later, Sarah arrived at the bus station. Using the little money she had saved while helping Grace, she bought a one-way ticket to Louisville, Kentucky. The bus was old, its seats worn, and only a handful of passengers occupied the scattered rows. As the vehicle rolled through the dark roads, Sarah stared out the window, trying not to cry. "This is best for everyone," she murmured to herself, as if needing to reinforce her decision. Deep down, however, she knew that leaving Grace behind felt like abandoning the only semblance of home she had ever known. Arriving in Louisville was a shock. The city was loud, bustling, and indifferent, a stark contrast to the quiet of Willow Creek. With her backpack slung over her shoulders and her violin in hand, Sarah wandered the streets, searching for a shelter where she could rest. She eventually found a small, crowded place where a weary-looking staff member handed her a form. "We have a few rules here. Stick to the schedule and keep an eye on your belongings. We're not responsible for anything you lose," he said, without looking directly at her. Sarah nodded and found an empty corner to sit. The shelter's walls were stained and peeling, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. Even so, it was better than the cold streets. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to find work, but her age and circumstances made it nearly impossible. Moreover, the shelter, which she had hoped would be a place of safety, soon revealed a darker side. One morning, while eating breakfast in the cafeteria, she discovered that her small pouch of savings had been stolen. "No, this can't be happening," she exclaimed, frantically searching through her belongings. When she reported the theft, the shelter's administrator eyed her with skepticism. "Are you sure you didn't lose it? Or spend it without realizing?" he asked, his tone making her feel even smaller. "No, I know someone took it," Sarah insisted, but no one seemed willing to help. Worse, rumors began to spread, and some started accusing her of being the troublemaker. "Girls like her always bring drama," she overheard a woman whisper to another. Desperate and out of options, Sarah began avoiding contact with others at the shelter. Her violin, her only remaining possession, became her constant companion. One night, while playing softly to herself, trying to bring some peace to her mind, a familiar figure appeared at the shelter's door. "Sarah?" Grace's voice echoed like a ray of light. Sarah immediately stood up, her mouth slightly open in surprise. "Grace, how did you find me?" Grace walked up to her, her eyes shining with relief and concern. "Did you really think I would just give up on you?" "No, dear. I read your note and knew you were trying to protect me, but I couldn't leave you alone." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. For the first time since leaving Willow Creek, she felt truly seen again. "Grace, I didn't want you to suffer because of me." Grace hugged her tightly. "You're not a burden, Sarah. You're family now, and family takes care of each other, even when things get tough." Those words made Sarah break down. All the weight of rejection, fear, and loneliness finally found release in her uncontrollable sobs. The next day, Sarah returned to Willow Creek with Grace. The journey back was quiet, but full of mutual understanding. Sarah knew the return wouldn't be easy. There would still be whispers, judgments, and challenges, but now with Grace by her side, she felt she could face anything. When they arrived at the bakery, they found the storefront still marked by vandalism, but Grace was determined to rebuild. "We'll do this together, Sarah. We'll show them that kindness and courage always win." And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt she was exactly where she belonged. The vandalized storefront was a stark reminder of Willow Creek's prejudices. Sarah stared at the red-painted words, feeling a mix of shame and anger. Grace stood beside her, arms crossed, taking a deep breath. "Well, this isn't going to clean itself," Grace said, breaking the silence and trying to keep the tone light. She went to fetch buckets, brushes, and soap, while Sarah stood still processing the impact of the hate directed at them. When Grace returned, she handed Sarah a brush and gave her an encouraging look. "It doesn't matter what they say, Sarah. What matters is how we choose to respond." Sarah gripped the brush firmly and began scrubbing the paint. The words slowly faded away, but the emotional weight lingered. Grace, as always, worked silently, her focus unwavering. For hours, they cleaned the wall, restoring the bakery's appearance. Sarah felt a small spark of pride when she saw the result. Despite everything, the place seemed more welcoming than ever. "There, now let's get back to work," Grace said with a tired smile. Sarah smiled back, but the fear of new attacks still lingered in her mind. In the days that followed, Grace and Sarah faced a new challenge, a drop in customers. Many Willow Creek residents, influenced by rumors, avoided the bakery. The tables sat empty, and the doorbell barely rang. Sarah watched as Grace tried to stay optimistic, but she could see the growing worry on her face. Feeling responsible, Sarah decided to act. "Grace, what do you think about organizing something different? An event, maybe. We could run a promotion or offer live music to attract people." Grace thought for a moment, then smiled. "That's a wonderful idea. And maybe you could play your violin." The suggestion caught Sarah off guard. Playing violin in public? It had been months since she'd played for anyone but herself. "I'm not sure if I'm ready," she began, but Grace interrupted her. "You're much stronger than you think, Sarah. And your music might be exactly what we need to remind people of what really matters." That week, Grace and Sarah worked tirelessly to prepare for the event. They put up posters around town, made flyers, and even handed out free samples of the bakery's sweets to grab people's attention. At night, Sarah practiced, reconnecting with her violin in a way she hadn't in a long time. Finally, the day arrived. The little bakery was adorned with lights and flowers, and the display case showcased the most irresistible treats. A table was set up on the sidewalk, where Grace served tea and coffee to customers. Sarah was in the corner, holding the violin with trembling hands. She glanced at the few people beginning to gather, most wearing curious expressions. "Are you ready?" Grace asked, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. As she began to play, the soft sounds of the violin floated through the air. The melody was simple but full of emotion. Gradually, passers-by stopped to listen. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the music carry her away. When she finished the first piece, there was a moment of silence before the applause began. Sarah opened her eyes, surprised to see smiles on the faces in the crowd. It was the first time she had felt anything other than judgment from the residents of Willow Creek. "That was beautiful," an older woman exclaimed, approaching Grace. "It's so nice to see something different in town." Others began to enter the bakery, buying bread and pastries, and soon the small space was bustling. Sarah, still emotional, watched the scene with a mix of relief and hope. When the event ended, Grace locked the door and turned to Sarah. "You were amazing, sweetheart. I think things are going to get better from here." Sarah gave a timid smile. For the first time, she felt that maybe there was a place for her in Willow Creek, but not everyone was ready to embrace change. That night, Dylan and his friends, angered by the event's success, decided to act again. They gathered in front of the bakery, carrying spray paint cans and rocks. "Let's show them we don't want that girl here," Dylan said, spurring the others on. As they prepared to vandalize the bakery once more, a figure appeared at the corner. It was the local pastor, Reverend Thomas, known for his firm voice and respected presence. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice echoing down the street. The boys hesitated, uneasy. "Do you think destroying someone's hard work makes you strong? On the contrary, it shows nothing but weakness. Now leave before I call the police." Embarrassed, the group fled. The next morning, Grace found the Reverend at the bakery door. "I heard about what you've been going through," he said with a gentle smile. "I want you to know that some people in this town are on your side." Those words brought relief to Grace and Sarah, who began to realize that not everyone in Willow Creek was against them. The event at the bakery marked the beginning of a new chapter for Sarah and Grace. While prejudice in Willow Creek hadn't vanished entirely, something had started to shift. People who had come for the music and pastries left with a new perspective on the young woman they had so quickly judged. Even so, Sarah knew not everyone was willing to change. Dylan and his group still lingered near the bakery, casting malicious glances and muttering provocative comments whenever they had the chance. One afternoon, while Sarah was arranging the display, Dylan walked in. It was rare to see him inside the bakery, and Sarah's stomach churned. He approached the counter with that smile that made her want to disappear. "So the violinist turned baker," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must be tough, huh? Knowing everyone talks about you behind your back." Sarah took a deep breath. He wanted a reaction, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "What do you want, Dylan?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just looking around." He leaned on the counter. "I hear you and Miss Grace are trying to be the town's new saints." Before Sarah could respond, Grace appeared. "Can I help you, Dylan?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Dylan straightened, clearly uncomfortable in her presence. "I was just leaving," he replied, retreating toward the door. "Good luck with the bakery. You're gonna need it." When he left, Sarah finally exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Are you okay?" Grace asked, concerned. "Yes. It's just, he always makes me feel so small." Grace placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "What he says doesn't define who you are. Remember that." That night, Sarah lay awake, her thoughts spinning. She didn't want to live in fear anymore, but standing up to someone like Dylan felt impossible. Still, something inside her told her the narrative had to change. The next day, she made a decision. "Grace, can I talk to you?" "Of course, dear. What is it?" "I want to organize another event, but this time, I want to invite Dylan and his friends." Grace remained silent for a moment, clearly surprised. "Are you sure? After everything they've done?" Sarah nodded. "Oh, yes. They need to hear what I have to say. I can't change how they see me, but I can show them I'm not weak." The new event was announced as a night of music and community. Grace hesitated to invite Dylan, but Sarah insisted. On the night of the event, the bakery was packed again. There was an air of anticipation, but also tension. Dylan and his friends arrived late, sitting at the back laughing and whispering amongst themselves. Sarah stepped onto the small makeshift stage, holding her violin. She scanned the audience, and her gaze stopped on Dylan. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know many of you have heard stories about me. Maybe you even believed them. But tonight, I want to tell my story." The room fell silent. Dylan crossed his arms, his face unreadable. "Months ago, I lost everything. My home, my family, and almost myself. But Grace gave me a chance. Something I didn't even think I deserved. I can never repay what she did for me. But I hope that through my music I can show who I really am." She raised the violin and began to play. The melody that filled the space was different from the one she had played at the first event. There was pain, struggle, and resilience in every note. The music seemed to tell her story more powerfully than words ever could. When she finished, a heavy silence hung in the air. Then, the applause began. It was louder and more heartfelt than any she had ever heard. Dylan, however, didn't clap. He stood abruptly and left, followed by his friends. Later that same night, as Sarah and Grace were cleaning the bakery, the door opened. Sarah looked up, surprised to see Dylan standing there alone. "Can I talk to you?" he asked in a tone she didn't expect, restrained, almost hesitant. Grace glanced at Sarah, waiting for her decision. Sarah nodded. "Sure." Dylan stuffed his hands into his pockets and avoided her gaze. "I wanted to apologize for what I did, for what I said." Sarah was surprised but tried not to show it. "Why?" He shrugged, still not meeting her eyes. "My life isn't easy either. Sometimes it's easier to take it out on someone else, but hearing you play made me feel like an idiot." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had never expected to hear this from Dylan. "Thank you," she finally replied. He nodded and left, leaving her with a mix of relief and confusion. The next morning, Sarah told Grace everything. "Sometimes, Sarah, people need an example to change. Maybe you were that for him." Sarah smiled. For the first time, she felt she was truly finding her place, not just in the bakery, but in Willow Creek. The days after the event at the bakery were different. There was something in the air of Willow Creek that felt lighter, less hostile. Sarah noticed people's gazes on the streets, but instead of judgment, they carried a mix of curiosity and respect. At the bakery, business was picking up again. Some townsfolk who had kept their distance started returning, bringing words of praise for Sarah's music and Grace's courage in standing up for her. "It seems like things are finally changing, doesn't it?" Grace said one afternoon, as they arranged fresh bread in the display case. Sarah smiled, but the smile quickly faded when the doorbell rang. She turned and felt the world stop. It was her mother. Margaret Miller looked aged. Her eyes were sunken, and her hair, once impeccably styled, was now disheveled and streaked with grey. She hesitated at the door, as though unsure if she should enter. "Sarah." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Grace, sensing the tension, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me, sweetheart." Margaret took a few steps forward but stopped, as if an invisible barrier prevented her from getting closer to her daughter. "You look beautiful," she said, attempting a smile. Sarah didn't respond. She was frozen, trying to understand how someone who had rejected her could now dare to show up in her life again. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice cold and harder than ever before. Margaret swallowed hard. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I needed to see you. I needed to ask for forgiveness." "Forgiveness?" Sarah laughed, incredulous. "Forgiveness for kicking me out? For leaving me alone when I needed you most? I was wrong, Sarah. I know that now." Margaret lowered her head, tears beginning to stream down her face. "When you left, your absence destroyed our family. Your father, he never got over what we did to you." "My father?" Sarah asked, her stomach knotting. Margaret nodded, her face marked with pain. "John got sick not long after you left. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. All he did was blame himself. He passed away 2 years ago." The revelation hit Sarah like a blow. Though she was angry at her father, the idea of never being able to confront him, never hearing an explanation from him, was devastating. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked, fighting to hold back tears. "Because I need to try to fix what's left of our family. I know it's too late, but I want to meet my granddaughter. I want to know her before it's too late for me as well." Grace entered the room with a tray of tea, noticing that Sarah was on the verge of breaking down. "How about we sit and talk calmly?" Grace suggested, setting the tray on a table. Sarah looked at Grace for support, then at Margaret, whose pleading expression was almost impossible to ignore. "Fine," Sarah said at last, "but this doesn't mean I'm going to forgive you." Margaret nodded, seeming relieved not to be outright rejected. The conversation was long and full of uncomfortable silences. Margaret spoke about the years after Sarah's departure, about the emptiness that consumed their home, and John's struggle with guilt. I was a coward, Sarah. Instead of facing what I had done, I hid behind my pride. But now, all I want is to try to make things right. Sarah listened in silence, her heart torn between the urge to reject her mother as she had been rejected and the hope that something good might come from this reunion. When the conversation ended, Margaret stood, hesitant. "Thank you for listening. I understand if you never want to see me again." Sarah took a deep breath. "I need time, but if you really want to meet Emma, you'll have to prove that you've changed." Margaret nodded, wiping her tears. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the days that followed, Margaret began showing up at the bakery, offering help with small tasks. She never forced conversations with Sarah, simply working in silence, demonstrating through her actions that she was willing to put in the effort to rebuild her bond with her daughter. Emma, curious about the grandmother she had never met, started asking questions. "Mom, what's she like? Why wasn't she here before?" Sarah didn't know how to answer. How could she explain to a 13-year-old the pain of being rejected by her own parents? "She made a lot of mistakes, Emma, but it seems like she wants to fix things now." "Are you going to let her?" Emma asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. Emma's question echoed in Sarah's mind. She knew forgiving wouldn't be easy, but maybe for her daughter's sake it was worth a try. The sun was shining over Willow Creek that morning, but Sarah felt a heaviness in her chest. Seeing Margaret again had stirred painful memories, along with a flicker of hope she was reluctant to acknowledge. While Grace prepared the bakery to open, Sarah looked out the window, watching Emma play with Grace's cat in the garden. The girl seemed unaware of the tensions lingering in the air, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the questions would start coming. "Are you thinking about your mom?" Grace asked, placing a tray of fresh bread on the counter. Sarah sighed. "I can't stop. She seems sincere, but part of me is still so hurt. I don't know if I can forgive her." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and sat down next to Sarah. "Forgiveness is more for you than for her, sweetheart. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened, but it means not carrying that burden alone forever." Sarah stayed silent, reflecting on Grace's words. That afternoon, Margaret arrived at the bakery, carrying a basket of fresh apples she had picked from an orchard in town. It was her way of trying to contribute, but Sarah felt the tension rise every time she saw her. "Hello, Sarah," Margaret said with a hesitant smile. Sarah replied with a brief nod, unsure how to start a conversation. Emma, however, who had just run in from outside, stopped when she saw her grandmother. "Mom, is that her?" Emma asked, a mix of curiosity and nervousness in her voice. Margaret crouched slightly, trying to be at eye level with her granddaughter. "You must be Emma," she said softly. Emma looked at Sarah, as if seeking permission to approach. Sarah hesitated but finally nodded. "Hi," Emma said shyly. Margaret smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "You're so beautiful. I've waited so long to meet you." "Why didn't you come sooner?" Emma asked with the blunt innocence of a child. The question made Margaret swallow hard. She looked at Sarah, who averted her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. "Because I made a very big mistake," Margaret said sincerely. "But I want to make things right if you and your mom will let me." Emma seemed to consider this for a moment before giving a small smile. "Do you like apple pie? We make a really good one here." Margaret chuckled softly, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "I'd love to try it." The days that followed were filled with small interactions between Emma and Margaret. The girl seemed to accept her grandmother's presence with a surprising ease, but for Sarah, the process was much more complicated. One afternoon, as Margaret helped Emma decorate cookies in the bakery kitchen, Sarah watched from a distance, her heart torn between the joy of seeing her daughter smile and the weight of past wounds. Grace noticed her unease and approached. "It's hard, isn't it?" Grace asked. Sarah nodded. "Sometimes I think it's easier to hold on to anger than to risk being hurt again. But do you see how Emma is?" Grace gestured toward the girl, who was laughing as Margaret tried to pipe frosting onto a cookie, creating a clumsy design. "Maybe this could be the start of something good for you two, too." One evening, after the bakery had closed, Margaret asked Sarah to talk. "Can we speak? Just the two of us." Sarah hesitated but agreed. They sat at the kitchen table, where Grace had left tea for both of them. "I know nothing I say can erase what I did," Margaret began, "but I want you to know that when you left, my life lost all meaning. I was so worried about what people would think, about the family's reputation, that I forgot what really mattered." "And what's changed?" Sarah asked, her tone skeptical. Margaret sighed. "When your father got sick, he started talking about you all the time. He said he wanted to apologize, that he should have done things differently. At first, I didn't want to admit he was right, but the truth is, he was. We failed you. I failed you. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. Now you think you can just show up and fix everything? She asked, her tone sharper than she intended. No, Sarah, I don't think I can fix everything. I just want a chance to try, not for the past, but for what we can build moving forward. Sarah looked at her mother, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe her, but another part was still wounded. I need time, Mom. Margaret nodded, respecting her daughter's request. Take all the time you need, I'll be here. In the days that followed, Sarah began to watch Margaret's actions more closely, the way she helped Emma, the patience she showed with simple tasks at the bakery, and the care she took not to invade Sarah's space. It was different from the rigid woman Sarah remembered. One evening, while putting Emma to bed, Sarah found her daughter holding a small photo album Margaret had brought. Look, Mommy, she has pictures of you when you were little, Emma said excitedly, pointing to an image of baby Sarah in her father's arms. Sarah took the album, feeling a mix of nostalgia and pain. She flipped through the pages slowly, seeing pictures she thought had been lost forever. On the last page, she found a handwritten note from Margaret. I should never have let you go. If I could go back, I'd do everything differently. But now all I can do is try to be better for you and Emma. With love, Mom. Sarah closed the album, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. Maybe Grace was right. Forgiveness wasn't for Margaret. It was for herself. In the days that followed, Sarah began allowing Margaret to take a bigger role in her life. It wasn't a sudden change, but a series of small steps. A guarded smile, casual conversation, or a word of gratitude here and there. However, forgiveness didn't come without challenges, and the scars of the past still lingered in the present. Emma, on the other hand, was growing closer to her grandmother. The little girl seemed eager to absorb everything about the woman who had once been a distant and mysterious figure. Did you know my mum used to play the violin when she was little? Emma said excitedly, as Margaret helped her make a pie in the kitchen. Margaret chuckled softly. Yes, and she was amazing. The sound would fill the house. Your grandfather was so proud. From the corner of the room, Sarah overheard the conversation and felt a pang in her chest at the mention of John. Despite all the pain, she couldn't ignore that he had once been a loving father during her childhood before everything fell apart. Margaret turned to Sarah and with a shy smile asked, Do you still play? Sarah hesitated before answering. Sometimes, but not as much as I used to. You should play more. It always brought so much life to you and everyone around you. Sarah didn't respond, but the suggestion lingered in her mind. A few days later, Margaret suggested they take a walk together to the old lake where Sarah used to play as a child. Why do you want to go there? Sarah asked, wary. I want to show you something, Margaret replied. Despite her hesitation, Sarah agreed. They walked down the dirt path surrounded by trees, Emma running ahead, thrilled by the adventure. When they reached the lake, Margaret pointed to an old tree where initials and dates were still carved into the bark. Your dad and I used to bring you here when you were little. This is where you took your first steps. Sarah stared at the tree, faintly recalling the happy moments of her childhood. I don't know why you stopped bringing me here, she said, her tone more bitter than she intended. Margaret sighed, her expression somber. Because over time we became so worried about what others thought that we forgot what really mattered. That's what I regret most, Sarah. Sarah looked at Margaret and saw tears in her mother's eyes. It wasn't the first time Margaret had apologized, but something about this confession felt more genuine, more raw. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know I lost so much precious time with you, but I promise I won't waste another second. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the weight of those words settle in her heart. I still don't know if I can completely forgive you, Mum, but I'm willing to try. Margaret smiled, a mix of relief and emotion, as Emma ran toward them, carrying flowers she had picked by the lake. Look what I found, said the girl, breaking the tension of the moment. Sarah chuckled softly and accepted the flowers. Back at the bakery, Grace noticed the subtle change in Sarah. Looks like things are getting better, she commented as she prepared coffee for the morning customers. It's not perfect, but we're trying, Sarah replied as she helped organize the shelves. The peace, however, was interrupted when a familiar face walked through the door. Dylan. He was alone, without the group of friends who usually accompanied him. He looked nervous, as if just being there was a challenge. Sarah, can I talk to you? He asked, glancing around, clearly uncomfortable with the customers' stares. Grace shot a worried look at Sarah, but she nodded. Let's go outside. Outside the bakery, Dylan fidgeted with his pockets, avoiding Sarah's gaze. I wanted to thank you for that event, and to really apologize this time. Sarah crossed her arms, still cautious. Why? I grew up hearing that it was wrong to show weakness, that being respected was the most important thing, even if it meant being cruel. But when I heard you play, I realized that maybe true respect comes from being honest. Sarah was surprised by his sincerity, but didn't respond immediately. What about what you did? The words, the attacks on the bakery. Dylan took a deep breath, clearly regretful. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'm trying to be different. I wanted you to know that. Sarah studied him for a moment before answering. Okay, Dylan, but change takes time. If you really want to be different, show it through your actions. Dylan nodded, visibly relieved not to have been rejected outright. In the days that followed, Dylan started showing up at the bakery, offering to help with small repairs or just stopping by for coffee. Though many still doubted his intentions, Sarah and Grace noticed a genuine effort on his part to change. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to carve out small spaces in Sarah and Emma's lives. She began sharing stories from the past, revealing sides of John that Sarah had never known, like his love for poetry and how he would sing while working in the yard. He had so many hopes for you, Sarah. I think deep down he knew you had something special. These stories helped Sarah see her father in a new light. Despite everything, he had loved her, even if he didn't know how to show it when she needed it most. One night, while Emma slept and Margaret read a book in the living room, Sarah picked up her violin. She sat in her room and began to play, letting the emotions she had been holding back flow through the strings. Margaret appeared in the doorway silent, tears in her eyes. When Sarah finished, she looked at her mother, and in that moment, without a word, both of them knew they were taking a step toward healing together. The next morning was filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of soft laughter from the bakery kitchen. Sarah and Margaret were more at ease, sharing the space like never before. As Emma helped decorate a cake, Grace walked in holding an envelope that had just arrived. Sarah, this is for you. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and took the envelope. There was no sender, only her name written in elegant handwriting. She carefully opened it and found an invitation. A music festival was being held in a nearby town, and someone had submitted her name to perform. A festival? Grace asked, peering over Sarah's shoulder. Yes, it looks like they heard about the event we held here. Sarah was still processing the idea. That's amazing, Emma said excitedly. Are you going to play, Mom? Sarah hesitated. The thought of playing for a larger audience filled her with nervousness. I don't know, Emma. I'm not sure if I'm ready for something like this. Of course you are, Grace interrupted with an encouraging smile. Your music touched the hearts of people here, and it can touch so many more. Margaret, who had remained silent, finally spoke. You have a gift, Sarah, don't hide it. Your father would have been so proud to see how far you've come. Margaret's words surprised Sarah. She hadn't expected to feel such comfort coming from her mother, but those words made her reconsider. All right, she finally said. I'll try. In the following days, Sarah threw herself into rehearsals. The violin, which had once been just a personal refuge, became once again a tool for connecting with something greater. Emma, always curious, watched the rehearsals with admiration. Do you think people will like it? Sarah asked Grace after a practice session. I'm sure they'll love it, Grace replied. Your music has something special, something that touches the soul. Margaret, who also quietly attended the rehearsals, occasionally offered words of encouragement. Though there was still a long way to go, the barriers between mother and daughter were starting to come down. On the night of the festival, Sarah felt the nerves take over. She was backstage holding her violin with trembling hands. Margaret and Grace were in the audience alongside Emma, who was waving a small banner she'd made herself. Go, Mommy. When it was Sarah's turn, she stepped onto the stage under a warm spotlight. The audience looked immense, and the low hum of conversations made her heart race. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to play. The music that flowed from the violin was more than technique. It was pure emotion. Every note seemed to carry a piece of her story. The pain of rejection, the struggle for survival, the unexpected kindness of Grace, and now, the strength of forgiveness beginning to bloom within her. When the last note rang out, there was a moment of absolute silence followed by thunderous applause. Sarah opened her eyes and saw emotional faces in the crowd. Emma was standing, clapping enthusiastically. Margaret wiped away tears while Grace smiled proudly. After the performance, several people approached to congratulate her. Among them was a woman who organized musical events in the area. Your performance was wonderful. We're always looking for new talent. Would you consider participating in other festivals? Still surprised by the impact of her performance, Sarah smiled shyly. I'd love to. On the way back to Willow Creek, the car was filled with laughter and animated conversations. Sarah felt something different, a lightness, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in a long time. You were amazing, Mommy, Emma said, hugging her. Thank you, my love, Sarah replied with a sincere smile. Margaret, sitting in the front seat next to Grace, turned to her daughter. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah, not just for what you played, but for who you've become." Sarah looked at her mother, surprised by her sincerity. "Thank you, Mum." It was a simple exchange, but one full of meaning. In the following days, news of Sarah's performance began spreading through Willow Creek. The townspeople, once reserved, started to approach her more, congratulating her on her talent and praising the courage she had shown by sharing her story. Dylan, who had heard about the festival, stopped by the bakery one day. "I heard you were incredible at the festival. I just wanted to say I'm happy for you," he said with a genuine expression. Sarah nodded, appreciating his effort to make amends. As the months went by, Sarah began performing at other events, balancing her music with her work at the bakery and life with Emma. Margaret became a constant presence, helping Sarah and Grace with their tasks and, most importantly, building a strong bond with Emma. One evening, while Emma slept, Sarah and Margaret sat on Grace's porch, talking. "I think I'm finally starting to forgive you," Sarah said honestly. Margaret sighed, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'll never stop trying to be the mother you deserve, Sarah." Sarah looked at the stars, then at Margaret. "I think you're on the right path." The months following her performance at the festival had been transformative for Sarah. Her music continued to open doors, while her bonds with Margaret and the Willow Creek community grew stronger each day. Still, balancing her talent, the bakery responsibilities and raising Emma required constant effort. One sunny morning, while Grace and Margaret were busy in the kitchen, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. "Sarah Miller? This is Lisa Bennett from the Indiana Youth Orchestra. I saw your performance at the festival and was impressed. We're looking for new talent for next season, and I believe you'd be a fantastic addition." Sarah froze. The idea of playing in a professional orchestra had been a dream that seemed far out of reach since childhood. I don't know what to say. This is incredible," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "We'll provide a scholarship so you can focus on your music. It's an opportunity that doesn't come around every day." When the call ended, Sarah stood still for several minutes, holding the phone. Her thoughts raced. It was a chance to achieve the dream she had almost let slip away, but it also meant leaving Willow Creek, the bakery, Grace, and perhaps Margaret, who had just returned to her life. That evening, Sarah shared the offer with Grace and Margaret. "That's wonderful, dear," Grace said, clearly emotional. "You deserve every bit of this opportunity. Yes, it's an incredible chance, but it would mean leaving you here, and Emma would have to adapt to a new city." Margaret was silent for a moment, but then took her daughter's hand. "Sarah, don't let the past or fear hold you back. If this is what you want, go for it. We'll be here to support you no matter where you are." Margaret's words deeply moved Sarah. For so long she had felt she needed to fight alone. Now she had a support system that made the decision less daunting. "I need to think about it." In the days that followed, Sarah sought advice from Grace, Margaret, and even Emma, who seemed more excited than anyone. "Are we going to live in another city? That'll be fun," Emma said with a grin. "And you're going to be famous." Sarah laughed but still felt torn. One night she sat on the porch with Margaret, who seemed to be waiting for her. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Margaret asked. "I feel like if I leave, I might lose what we've built here. Especially with you, Mum." Margaret shook her head, holding Sarah's hands. "What we're rebuilding, Sarah, doesn't depend on distance. It depends on commitment. And I'm committed to you and Emma, no matter where you are." Sarah wiped away a single tear that rolled down her cheek. "I wish Dad could see this." "He does, Sarah." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining. "I'm sure he's very proud of who you've become." By the end of that week, Sarah made her decision. She gathered Grace, Margaret, and Emma at the bakery, now a place of comfort and warmth. "I've accepted the offer," she said at last. Grace and Margaret smiled as Emma jumped with joy. "We'll get everything ready for you," Grace said. "And Sarah, remember, this bakery will always be your home, no matter where you are." The preparations for the move happened quickly. Margaret decided to accompany Sarah and Emma for the first few months, while Grace stayed in Willow Creek to manage the bakery. The farewell was filled with tears and tight embraces. "I could never have made it this far without you, Grace," Sarah said, her voice full of emotion. "You made it because you're strong, dear. Now go and shine." Then in her new city, Sarah faced challenges but also discovered new possibilities. The orchestra brought discipline and inspiration, while Emma began to adjust to her new school with Margaret's attentive support. The bond between mother and daughter continued to grow stronger. Margaret attended Sarah's rehearsals and helped Emma with her schoolwork. More than ever, Sarah felt that forgiveness was a continuous journey, but one filled with profound rewards. 3 years later, Sarah returned to Willow Creek for a special event organized by the community. Grace's small bakery was bustling with life, filled with loyal customers and the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked bread. "I knew you'd come back to play here one day," Grace said, hugging Sarah tightly. That evening, Sarah performed in the town square, surrounded by the people who had witnessed her journey. At the end of the show, she dedicated a song to Grace and Margaret, the two women who, in different ways, had saved her life. As the final note echoed, the applause was unanimous. Sarah looked at Emma, who stood beside Margaret in the audience, and felt a peace she had never experienced before. Willow Creek was no longer just the place where her life had fallen apart. It had become the starting point for a path of forgiveness and redemption. If you were touched by the story of Sarah, Grace, and Margaret, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe forgiveness can truly heal the wounds of the past? Tell us your opinion. We bring you moving stories almost every day, just waiting for you. Click the links appearing on the screen for more amazing stories.